So historically, I've used Firebase for its real-time database properties, but it also allows for user management and essentially a full robust backend as a service set of functionality. And in particular, I wanted to start playing around with authentication through Firebase so that I could add more security to Firebase-backed applications. So in this demo, I wanted to explore the idea of a magic email link, which is essentially an email link that Firebase will send to me, which I can then click on, which will automatically log me in to my Angular application. So let's take a look at this workflow. So first I have to provide my email address so that Firebase can send the link. And you can see that the Firebase client SDK is communicated with the Firebase backend. It's telling me that it sent me a link. And if I jump over into my email client, what I get is something that looks like this. And you can actually see this is the latest link that came in here. Obviously, I've been testing this. And here is the magic email link that comes through. And this is a link to Firebase. Firebase will then redirect back to the Angular application, at which point the user is allowed to essentially close up or confirm the authentication workflow. So let's copy this link. Let's jump back into the demo. So if I now paste this in here, you'll see that it goes to Firebase and then it jumps back here. And at this point, for security reasons, to prevent session fixation attacks, I have to now confirm the email address that was used to send out the original link. Now, for this demo, I'm asking the user to do this explicitly. However, if we had stored the email address in something like local storage, we could have actually performed this confirmation implicitly. But for the sake of the demo, I'm doing it explicitly. I'm going to sign in, and you'll see here Firebase goes and talks to the backend services, googleapis.com. It starts a new user session. It will create the new user if it doesn't yet exist. And you can now see that I am authenticated. And in fact, I have a link to sign out. And what you'll see is if I refresh the page, I maintain authentication. Now, by default, the Firebase session is very long-lived, and you have to explicitly sign out of it. But you can change the session duration as part of the authentication workflow. That's not something that I do in this demo, but it is possible. So let's take a look at how this works in Angular. Because the actual calls to make all the authentication are actually very simple. It's just the Firebase SDK, and I'm essentially calling a method to send a link. I'm calling another method to see if this is an authentication URL, and then I'm calling another method to actually authenticate, and there's another method to sign out. The tricky part of the demo is trying to figure out how to integrate Firebase with Angular in such a way that I didn't have to bring in a whole lot of bloat like the router and subcomponents and things that you would do in a quote-unquote production app, but probably are overkill for a demo. So let's jump into the code. First, I just want to look at the template for the Angular app component because it sort of lays out the steps for the authentication workflow. So the first thing that I render here based on this ng switch for view is loading. And that's because Firebase manages the authentication status. So at the time we bootstrap the Angular application, there's no way for us to synchronously check whether or not a user is currently authenticated. So I throw the application into this loading state while I'm waiting for Firebase to let me know whether or not the current user is authenticated. If they're not authenticated, I then render the login view, which is just a simple form. I end up calling send magic link to the given email value. That sends the email to the user. The user then clicks on the magic link. This is just a confirmation of the send. Clicks on the magic link, in which case we load the application into the Authenticate view. At that point, the user has to confirm their email address, at which point I call Authenticate, and that asks Firebase to authenticate the current email address against the current sign-in with email link URL of the application. And once the user is authenticated, I then render the home view. So that's all there is as far as the template is concerned for the entire demo. Again, I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. The goal here is to build a mental model for Firebase authentication, not necessarily a set of best practices on how you would integrate such a workflow into an Angular application. Now, if we look at the component side of this, again, there's just a couple of key methods. First, let's look at the ng on init. So this is our application, our Angular application being bootstrapped. You'll see that I initialize my Firebase application here, And at this point, again, we don't actually know if the current user is authenticated or not authenticated. So what I do is I subscribe to the on-auth state change, and this will get called anytime the user login status is changed, or when I think there's a couple of other key events that will end up triggering this. And then I immediately stop listening once that callback is invoked for the first time, because for this demo, I don't want to continually listen for state changes. All of my API calls will provide me with that information, so I don't need to know it on a stream-based kind of basis. I check to see if the current user is authenticated, in which case I set up the user object. And then I look at the current URL, window location href, and I ask Firebase, does the URL of the Angular application represent a URL that's being used as a sign-in with email link? If it is, I render the Authenticate page where they get to confirm their email address. Otherwise, I check to see if they're logged in, and then I either send them to home or login, which would again, of course, start the authentication workflow. If we look at the send magic link, so this is the login page where they enter their email address and they send it, you can see that all of these methods are essentially just proxies for Firebase SDK client method calls. Here I'm asking it to send an email link to the given email. Now, the one thing that I couldn't really get around was that I ultimately have to provide a publicly accessible URL, fully qualified URL to the Angular application. And I couldn't find a great way of doing that with the services that Angular provides. As such, if we jump down to the get app root URL, you'll see that I'm actually leaning heavily on the window location object and the fact that I know the folder name that this is going to execute in. Historically, if I was building an Angular app that had a server-side component, I'd just send this root URL down as part of a bootstrap configuration payload so that the client-side application never had to guess. It would just be given that as part of its configuration. But in this case, I'm hosting on GitHub pages. There is no server-side component. I have to calculate this. If anyone has a better way to do this, I'm certainly all ears. So once the magic link gets sent out and then the user clicks on the Authenticate, or they get into the Authenticate view and they have to re-provide their email address, I then, again, this is just a proxy call to Firebase's SDK. I ask it to log the user in against the given URL, which is the magic email link URL, at which case, if the authentication worked, I set up the user, and because the URL contains the login request, what I try to do is actually move the user away from the current URL, such that if they were to refresh the page, the app doesn't think it's trying to re-authenticate against the previous magic email link. This will get them back to the root of the application, such that if they refresh, all they're doing is refreshing back into the root of the application, in which case I'll then check to see their authentication status via Firebase. And that's basically all there is to it. I have a sign out link somewhere down here. Again, it's just a proxy to an API call provided by the Firebase SDK. And there you go. It's pretty cool. I really love the fact that you can log in, create a user implicitly, and log in without having to manage or remember a password. Again, historically, I've used Firebase for its real-time database, but you can really start to see with the user management, the user authentication, how much power Firebase provides, and it really does lower that barrier to entry for the sort of so-called Jamstack, the JavaScript APIs and markup style application, where all you're doing is providing client-side application logic, and then Firebase is essentially managing all of the back-end portions for you, including a lot of stuff that I've never even looked at yet. But hopefully this is interesting, and this is definitely something I'll be looking into more for the Firebase applications that I build.